Now let's introduce our guest speaker, which was Scott Hanna, as I mentioned earlier, who, for those latecomers, is unfortunately very much under the weather and was not at the show today, and hopefully will be here the rest of the days. Instead, okay, I can't read Mark's introduction. You gotta understand, he graciously filled in like an hour ago. He agreed to fill in for Scott, and there was no opportunity for me to print up his introductory statement. So, skipping Scott Hanna's paragraph here. You want to read it? We've never had a guy have to introduce himself like this, but, oh, thank you. This will make it more comfortable. Mark McKenna, longtime pal of mine, has been inking comics starting his 34th year this year. He started in '85 at Marvel and had almost 600 credits and over 12,000 pages inked to his name. Recipient of the 2012 Inkwell Hall of Fame Award, Mark also created a children's book line, Banana Tale, and a horror miniseries, Combat Jacks, both of which he published under his Banana Tale Books banner. Now I introduce you to the 2012 Joe Sinnott Inkwell Awards Hall of Fame winner, Mark McKenna. Leave the phones here.
Now you know me? Yeah, there you go. I was a lot darker then. So did you. So I got here about 3 o'clock this afternoon. I have to tell you, 2 guys almost jumped me walking in with my stuff to fill in because Scott called in sick. I hadn't even set up yet, so I'm going to wing this. Also, because we're running about 45 minutes late, I'm going to give you guys a break. I'm going to give you a little bit of my background. I graduated the School of Visual Arts back in 1983. I went to School of Visual Arts because Will Eisner was a teacher there back in the early 80s. And when I went and took his class, I realized as wonderful as a talent as he was, he did the Spirit back in the 40s, if you guys didn't know that. Not a great teacher, but it wasn't his fault because he was brought in for his expertise and stuff like that. But I went away from the comic book business. I originally wanted to be a comic book artist when I graduated School of Visual Arts. After a year and a half, I decided to become an animation major. And then everything back then was hand-drawn, so it was about 1,100 drawings for 1 minute of hand-drawn animation. I was losing my shit after about 200 drawings and decided I didn't want to do that. So Marshall Arisman, who was the chairman of the illustration department at School of Visual Arts, took me in his office as a senior and said, "What are you going to do with this degree?" I said, "Listen, I started out because I wanted to be a comic book artist, but I kind of lost my way." And he goes, "Sal Almandola teaches here. He teaches perspective." Now, Sal Almandola was a new talent coordinator at DC Comics back in the 80s, in the early 80s. So what he did was, he goes, "I'm going to hook you up with Sal. You're going to go up to DC offices, meet with Sal, and get a vibe for the business." Well, when I went up to DC, I sat next to Clark Kent, this big 7-foot Clark Kent on a sofa. I don't know anybody who had been to DC back in the early 80s. It was pretty cool, you know, and they had a whole metropolis scape in the background behind them and everything. It was just awesome. I went in there. Sal gave me some samples to take home. I went home. I did them in a week. Brought them back. Felt kind of cocky about who I was, and thought I was going to get a job as soon as I went a week later. Sal turns to me and says, "You will do this. You can do this. Just you need more time." And I was a little crushed, but I also, once he told me that you can do this and you can make a living doing this, that was the gold right there. You know, even though it didn't happen to me for right then. I knew I could do it. So what he did do with me, Sal Almandola, was he brought me into classes at DC, had New Talent Showcase. It was a book they did back in the 80s. And he brought me in on classes with a lot of new up-and-coming guys. And we would go in every other Friday. Now, I lived in Long Island at the time, so I would commute on the Long Island Railroad 60 miles to New York, go to DC, which at the time was 666 Fifth Avenue. Marvel was about 25, 30 blocks away. So what I would do is I would take my lessons at DC, and then I would go to Marvel and show my samples and leave my samples at the door. And one day, I get a call from John Romita Sr. on the phone. Now, John Romita, if you don't know, John Romita Sr. was the Spider-Man artist of my childhood, pretty much, in the 60s and the 70s. And he calls me up and asks me if I want to get a job at Marvel Comics in 1984. I says, well, what does it pay? And first of all, I didn't believe it was John Romita. It was my friend Rick busting my chops, It was John Romita calling me up on the phone, So, that got loud. So after I figured out it was John, he offered me $4.50 an hour to commute from Long Island to New York for what we called the Romitas Raiders. We were a production team of guys that were learning hands-on on staff at Marvel Comics. I told him I couldn't afford $4.50 an hour, and I passed on it just because the commute to New York from Long Island would have been my whole paycheck pretty much every week, right? So he said, listen, I'll keep your name on the list, and I'll call you next time an opportunity comes. And God bless. He comes, after 2 passes, the third time he says, you have to either do this or I have to take your name off this list. I explained to him that, John, I can't afford $4.50 an hour. At the time, it didn't make sense for me to do that. I was working in an art supply store out in Port Jeff, Long Island. I was bringing home $225 a week, and I thought, that was the gold at the point. So I explained it to him, and then John said to me, what if I got you assisting other artists and inkers work? Could you do it then? I said, yes, I could do it then. What I ended up doing was I ended up moving to Staten Island, New York, taking the Staten Island ferry every day to Lower Manhattan and taking the R train to Marvel Comics. I did it for almost 2 years. I was on staff there. And the trick with that was that Marvel would never hire me to be an inker on a book because they always saw me as a production guy. So what I used to do now, remember I was in the beginning, I started to go to DC and go to Marvel to show my stuff. Now I was going from Marvel on my lunch breaks to DC and showing them my stuff. And I went to go meet Joe Orlando, who was a very famous artist in the EC stuff back in the 1950s. He was a special projects editor at DC, and I had a meeting with him at lunchtime on, I can't remember the given day. When I went into the offices at DC, he was out late for lunch, and I heard some rustling of some papers. I was basically had the whole empty hallway to myself, and I heard some rustling papers. And I stuck my head in one of the doors, and Karen Berger was there. Karen Berger was a group editor on a lot of the books, the mainstream superhero books at the time. And I left her my samples. I never got to meet Joe Orlando. I left my samples with her. Next day, I get a call from Karen Berger. She says, Mark, we'd like to hire you, give you a contract, a continuity contract, a bonus, medical benefits, and you're going to be inking Dr. Fate. Gold. I hit the gold right then, Quit Marvel like the next day, and went under contract for DC for 4 years, from 87 to 91. And ironically, it was when Ralph Macchio, not the Karate Kid, but the editor on Doctor Strange, called me up and said, we're doing Doctor Strange. And at the time, I was doing Doom Patrol. I was thinking Doom Patrol, Grant Morrison's Doom Patrol. Which, by the way, if you guys see that stuff on, anybody seen Doom Patrol on the streaming network? I don't get it. But I have to tell you, this is kind of cool. The stunt team just asked me if I would do a T-shirt design for the stunt team. So I said, you got to get Richard Case in here. Richard Case and I worked on Doom Patrol. He did it for a couple of years. I worked with him for 14 issues. So Richard and I did a whole brand new characters on the back of their jacket, the stunt team jacket, which is really cool. So anyhow, go back to that. So I was doing Doom Patrol, and then Ralph says we wanted to get some of that kind of Doom Patrol kind of art background onto Doctor Strange. And they brought me in, and I broke my contract with DC after 4 years, and I was back where I wanted to be to begin with. I was kind of a Marvel zombie back then. So that was 34 years ago this month. Started at Marvel in April of 1985. So 34 years. It's been good to me. Business has changed, as you guys probably know. You know, a lot of guys aren't, you know, Marvel's not paying what they used to pay, and you know, been a different business. So, but my blessing is that I have enough of a following and a name that I'm able to do my own books now, and I do a book called Combat Jacks, which is a sci-fi book that I do. I run 7 different Kickstarters for different individual comics, and then a collection. I do a children's book called Banana Tale. I've run 7 Kickstarters. I've succeeded in all of them so far. So somebody out there is paying attention to what I do still, and I'm really thankful for that. So I just want to say thank you for inviting me. I know it's, I'm going to go back to my table. I feel bad for the guy who's watching my stuff. Thank you for coming, and support the Inkwell Awards.
You want your phone? Thank you very much, Mark. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely, especially since Gil's stuff tended to be just like layouts even there often, you know, master storyteller, but he usually, anybody who's familiar with the source material, the printed Death of Gwen Stacey, Death of Green Goblin especially, that's considering it's such a high profile storyline, that definitely exemplifies the kind of partnership, this, as my buddy Sal would say, the synergy that really paid off. I mean, I think those are, that us in the community are really, we hope, we'll never forget that kind of work, the impact it had. Before, thank you for that, Chris.